Hello all. A bit of a left field video this one. I'm going to talk about Avengers Endgame. I initially intended to share my musings after posting the Snyder Cut video, but you know how it goes, life has a way of changing plans. Endgame was the culmination of 11 years and over 20 films in the MCU, leading to this final point, and it was okay. I'm a huge Marvel fan. I've always been more into Marvel than DC, and I've loved most of the films of the MCU, even the so-called bad ones. And I know Joss Whedon is persona non grata these days, but his first Avengers film is just sublime. I started reading comics, so many years ago because of the Avengers, so I was both terrified and excited about the first Avengers film, worrying it might be an utter disaster, but it's just an amazing film with so many quotable lines. Now the Russos, who directed Endgame, did a fantastic job on Winter Soldier, a pretty damn good job on Civil War, and knocked it out of the park with Infinity War. Though I feel they struggle a bit with the more fantastical elements, and the shift between the brilliant Infinity War and Endgame is a bit puzzling. For me, Infinity War was near perfect. It's very rare that I'm on the edge of my seat, and I was, despite having read the comics, but Endgame drops the ball by comparison. I have to admit, I do wish at some point Joss had some input, because for me he just gets it. I can't really talk about the film without spoilers, so be warned, there'll be spoilers ahead, and starting now in fact. Most people know the story. In Infinity War, Thanos won, snapping half the universe out of existence. The remaining heroes find him to get the stones, but he's destroyed them, so Thor goes for the head. 5 years later, Ant-Man plops out of the quantum realm and Tony invents time travel. They go back, get the Infinity Stones, whilst visiting moments in older films, bringing them to the future, unaware that Thanos from 2014 has followed. They snap everyone back right before Thanos attacks, cue climactic battle. The film's very long, and to be honest I started to drift off towards the middle. It has massive tonal shifts which make the movie feel uneven. The first act starts with some lovely scenes with Stark and Nebula bonding in the Milano as it limps through space. Yet after this intimate and intense experience, it's never mentioned or evoked throughout the entirety of the rest of the movie. In fact, I don't think they ever speak again. The tone is quite sombre, even more so after the 5 years later. We see a world mourning those lost, unable to move on, and elements of it are beautifully realised. After Ant-Man pops out of the quantum realm because of a rat walking across the controls, yep, seriously, a rat, the scenes of him walking the desolate streets are intense and moving. The look on the young lad's face when he asks what happened is haunting, and then you feel his panic when looking for his daughter on the list of the lost and the relief upon finding her alive. In contradiction, the scene with Cap feels much weaker and more wordy than needed. It feels that there's only really one reason that scene exists, though it does have Jim Starlin, the creator of Thanos, in it, and a moment where it's clear that Cap never really moved on. Natasha's holding the fort, which continues her superb arc, but it's weird Cap's not there too. It feels contrary to his nature to effectively give up. Captain Marvel appears long enough to be snarky again, so general role. When Scott arrives at the compound, he proposes the idea of time travel. Go back, get the stones, bring everyone back. So they go to see Stark, who's living a simple life with Pepper and their daughter. He's walked away from everything, and he's got a life that he never thought he would ever have. And he doesn't want to give that up. And who would? But it's Stark. He can't help tinkering. And unfortunately they overplay his genius because he solves time travel overnight. It may have taken longer, but it feels instant and far too easy. Meanwhile, Natasha, Cap and Scott call on Bruce, who has now become Lame Hulk, a big green joke. I'd hoped that Hulk would get his moment in this film after Infinity War, but it doesn't happen, and he's relegated to being a punchline. And this really represents the start of a massive and jarring tonal shift in the second act. Time travel invented, time to get the band back together again. Natasha goes to get Clint, who's lost it after his family died in the snap, and is killing criminals because they survived when his family didn't. Again, this feels underplayed, and could have been more expanded upon. There are elements of his hopelessness and remorse for what he'd become expressed through the film occasionally, but they feel like they could have been explored more. It feels like they could have gone further. Thor, on the other hand, is a bigger joke than the Hulk. I could almost see what they were going for. Thor failed in Infinity War, and that failure is weighing heavily upon him. He's broken, suffering from depression. He's become a drunk and a recluse. And I kind of get that. It could have been a brilliant reflection on PTSD, survivor's guilt, and carried the same level of pathos in that fantastic scene in Infinity War between him and Rocket, especially in one particular scene. But what we get instead is ongoing tacky-wacky style farce. Thor just becomes a pathetic blubbering clown. And this continues the tonal imbalance. I could see why they could be going for a more hopeful tone after the initial despair, but it comes across as just wacky, like a light-hearted caper, as if the seriousness and the stakes are forgotten, that the fate of the universe depends on what happens, and they're joking about Captain America's backside. It's jarring and a little dull. There are some nice callbacks, like when they visit the Battle of New York and a funny scene with Star-Lord on Morag. But this is the part I was losing interest and looking at my watch, curious to know how much longer the film was. But you do get a couple of scenes that rend your heart. One where Cap and Tony have to travel back to the 1970s and Cap fleetingly sees Peggy. You feel his heart break again. Then the real kicker, the scene on Voromir, because we know what it costs to get the stone. And here, Clint and Natasha fight over who should be the sacrifice, each wanting to be the one to give their lives that the other could live. There's a tragic beauty to it. Natasha ultimately wins, and it's a heartbreaking and beautiful conclusion to her arc. It's a shame the Black Widow film dumps all over that. And as fantastic an arc as it is, it's also a shame because Natasha was one of the more realised characters, and Scarlett Johansson's characterisation has been great. Again, when they all return, Nat not being there feels a bit underplayed. Similarly with the snap, I wish we'd seen a scene like the one between Thanos and Gamora with Bruce and Natasha. It would have added real depth to that moment, which felt underwhelming, and would have brought a conclusion to their funny, strange romance that never really happened. The film then redeems itself with this massive battle. It's overblown, ridiculous, and just glorious. There was a cheer in the cinema as Cap picked up Mjolnir, something teased in Age of Ultron, and the excitement was palpable when the snapped heroes come back, heralded by the line, "On your left." The conclusion and Tony's sacrifice was soul-crushingly sad, beautifully realised, and yes, I cried. The funeral was deeply emotional, though I do remember thinking at the time, what about Natasha? She's mentioned, but she doesn't get the same import. Maybe that's why I like the Disney Plus series Hawkeye so much, because you get that sense of closure. I'll get to the end in a minute, because obviously there's something I skipped. A moment that evoked almost as many groans in the cinema as Cap lifting Mjolnir got cheers. Of course, it's the female hero selfie moment. A scene which repeats a much better version we'd already seen in Infinity War. It's such a lame and contrived yay women moment, and it took me straight out of the movie. Setting aside the sheer illogic of it, it just kills the momentum of the film. And in the current MCU star we're far more familiar with, the female heroes easily dispatch adversaries their male counterparts struggled against. Sure, it's cool if the little girls feel empowered by a scene of a bunch of women standing around, but I'd have thought the fantastic moment where Wanda takes on and nearly beats Thanos on her own, or Captain Marvel bringing down the ship minutes before, would have been more empowering. It feels like an example of ideology eclipsing narrative. Now, as much as that scene annoys me, there's something else that I find far worse, and I alluded to it earlier: the neutering of the Hulk. Probably my only disappointment in Infinity War was the Banner Hulk arc, but I was hopeful he'd get a redemptive moment in Endgame. Sadly, that didn't really happen, and this actually ties into the pointlessness of Captain Marvel. Banner Hulk, or Professor Hulk as he's better known, is an absurd character, the result of the two resolving their differences, something we don't even get to see. He's mainly there for comic effect. The snap is pedestrian, but when he said the radiation was mainly gamma, I thought we'd get a super powered up Hulk, like the Maestro. Can you imagine how cool it would have been to see him get his moment going toe to toe with Thanos? But no, he's basically just sidelined in the battle. Instead we get Captain Marvel. The selfie scene aside, she feels very much crowbarred into this movie. and I wonder how many moments we lost to shine a light on this less than popular character. Rocket could have found Nebula and Stark tracking the Milano. Thor could have brought down the ship like he did in Infinity War. And did you notice Doctor Strange was totally sidelined playing with a water spout? Instead of that Captain Marvel versus Thanos moment, where they call back to a scene in Infinity War, completely intentionally obviously, but a scene they missed the point of, instead of a man hopelessly outmatched trying to resist a god, we get a woman with godlike powers doing better. It doesn't really compare. And again, how much better if that had been the Hulk scene? I'm not sure I can forgive the film for the lack of that Hulk moment. There's also been a lot made of the time travel element. Putting aside that when you introduce time travel and nothing matters anymore, I don't really expect time travel films to make sense, and this is no exception. They change their own rules. For the most part, I can ignore the inconsistencies if the ride is fun enough. And this leads onto another controversial moment, the conclusion of the film. Steve and Peggy getting their happily ever after. As I said earlier, Cap wouldn't quit. He couldn't quit. He couldn't stand on the sidelines as terrible events unfold, as history dictates. We know this from the first time we meet him. It makes absolutely no sense that he would go back and stay. It's not his character. But honestly, I don't care. I kind of set aside my critical mind and just thought it was a lovely moment that Steve and Peggy got their dance. And you know, sometimes that's enough. The downside though is it led to the awful Falcon and Winter Soldier series, but that's another video entirely. In conclusion, it's tonally patchy, uneven, overlong, and sometimes dull with some weird choices and bad humour, but it has some wonderful moments too and powerful emotional resonance at times, all capped off with one hell of a fun battle. Infinity War is by far the superior film, but Endgame is a solid and generally pleasing end to the first 3 phases of the MCU. And whilst you could probably watch Spider-Man Far From Home, it's a reasonable jumping off point. Anyway, I'll leave that there. If you can cast your minds back, what did you think to it? And what do you think of what the MCU's become since? If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and peace out.